So welcome to this conversation. My name is Trine Flockhart. I'm a professor at the University of Southern Denmark, and I am one of the directors of Center for War Studies. And I'm going to host this session. The event is hosted in cooperation between Center for War Studies and Center for American Studies, and we are so pleased that it has been possible to get General Wesley Clark to come here to speak to us about the war in Ukraine and NATO. So a very timely topic. There's a huge interest in it from our side, and I'm sure you are extremely busy at the moment. I cannot imagine what's going on. So I'm really pleased to welcome General Clark. Wesley Clark is a 4-star general, retired, and has a long military career behind him, where I think for what we're talking about today, perhaps the most important part of your career is acting as NATO Supreme Allied Commander during the war in Kosovo, which of course gives you a specific perspective on what we're talking about today. Some of you will also recognize the dates of this, that NATO was involved in a very in a campaign in Kosovo that ended in 1999. So General Clark has a lot of experience and a lot of valuable knowledge for helping us to better understand the tragedy that is currently unfolding in Ukraine. And also, I think, what the prospects might be for that conflict, and of course, what this means for NATO. And you can read much more about General Clark on our website. And if you have time, you can also Google him, but I would advise that you set quite a lot of time aside, because there's a lot of information on there. The format of the CWS conversations is that I ask some questions and some follow-ups, some of which are questions that have been submitted ahead of time by the audience. And the audience who's here now, you can also place questions and comments in. I would suggest that you use the chat function, and we may have time to incorporate them as well, but we'll see how it goes. And then I think we have about 45 minutes or so. So we should be able to learn a lot from today. So what I've done is I've divided the questions into sort of 6 groups. And we'll see how it goes, whether all of these questions get asked, but you, of course, should answer as long or as short as you want to. But let's just start with a sort of, I don't know whether I can say it's a warmer-up, but it's not really. But I guess within the context of now 19 days of brutal war in Ukraine, and looking back at history, where it is not the first time that Russia has invaded one of its neighbors. It did so in 2008 in Georgia, and of course it did so with the annexation of Crimea in 2014. So perhaps we shouldn't be surprised about what has happened. But nevertheless, I want to start out by asking you, what in this has surprised you the most, if you have been surprised at all?
I've been most surprised by the incompetence of the Russian military thus far to be able to complete the mission that was given to them by President Putin. We knew they would come in from the north. We knew they would use armored columns. We knew from their exercises that they have what they call these operational maneuver groups, these battalion task groups. They were supposed to sweep across the countryside, find penetrations, holes and gaps in the Ukrainian defenses, and converge on Kyiv and sweep into the capital, and they didn't do it. Partly it was a function of poor training, partly it was a function of bad weather that made the ground soft, so they had to stay roadbound. Partly it was a function of of just great Ukrainian defense. But that's the most surprising piece. The next most surprising piece is the Russians have proved surprisingly inept at using their air power. I thought they would be much more effective than this. So what we've got, instead of a 5 to 7 day blitzkrieg that overwhelmed Ukraine before the West could do anything about it, instead what we have is this grinding, awful humanitarian crisis that I think is increasingly mobilizing the West to intervene and stop it, hopefully through the United Nations, but if necessary, through other means.
Yeah, so there certainly are some surprises. This is what I think most people have been incredibly surprised about, how the blitzkrieg just didn't happen. But if we turn now to some questions about what's actually happening on the ground, and we're hoping that you can help us, who are probably not so expert in military matters, and some of us who have thought that the existence of old wars was just that, old wars, and now there's an old war happening on our doorstep. So what is your current assessment of the situation on the ground, and what is the importance of logistics and morale, I think, especially for the war in Ukraine?
Well, logistics and morale is very important, and thus far it's been poor on the Russian side. But Russians are just as smart as anybody else, and they're working hard to fix the logistics problems. The morale problem is more difficult. These Russian soldiers are not very well motivated. They're not very well trained in some of the units. Other units are. And so their airborne units are quite good. They've got Spetsnaz in there. There's at least 300 people from Wagner Group who are slashing and burning their way out of Luhansk, murdering and raping and just doing all the damage they can. These people are terrible mercenaries. And then there are the forces in the south. Some of them were naval infantry that have come in trying to reach Odessa through Mykolaiv. What's happening is that the logistics and the communications problems the Russians have suffered are being corrected slowly. The Ukrainian forces were always overmatched in terms of numbers, in terms of hardware, but they've got incredible tenacity and bravery. So they're going to fight hard. Just imagine, most of the Russian advance around Kyiv especially is a column. It's not a broad front of 24 tanks abreast, where the tanker looks to his left and right and he sees his comrades moving forward on line and he's afraid to halt. Here it's one tank in the front of him. That tank gets hit. The tank behind it, the crew says, what happened? And where did it come from? And what can I do? And can I pass it? And so it makes everything difficult. And this is the aim of the Ukrainians. And this is working so far around Kyiv. It's not working as well in the east or in the south. And that's where we're having dangers. And so we just can't tell what the balance is going to be. We desperately need to get air power in there on Kyiv's side to deal with the mobile Russian columns in the south and the east. That air power could be, as discussed, it could be additional MiGs that are loaned or given by other East European countries. I don't know what the solution is, because the people on the inside, our experts who have access to the resources and sensitive information, have to determine that. But we do know this, that air power is critical in dealing with these moving columns. And once they break free and start toward Kyiv, they will encircle Kyiv and cut off our ability to resupply Kyiv. And this is really the key point of the battle.
So I think you're referring to the long column, 40 miles long or 60 kilometers long column outside Kyiv that has now dispersed, as far as I understand. But why was that not a kind of sitting target to have attacked with even limited air power?
Well, you know, the Ukrainians have to ration out their air power. They've still got some aircraft, They've still got some airfields. They're playing hide and seek with the Russians on this. They've got to use their limited resources at the most decisive moments. That decisive moment hasn't come yet for Kyiv.
So they're hanging on to their planes for as long as they can.
That's my assessment. I don't know for sure. And if I did, I couldn't say.
And obviously hoping that that NATO and the US will change their mind in terms of supplying them with aircraft. But
I will tell you this, Trine. When I was the NATO commander, the Danish government was the most proactive in terms of seeking the enlargement of NATO, because they had the foresight to understand Russia, to know that Russia would be back someday. And I'm hoping that as a consequence of this talk, that Denmark will speak up more strongly in the councils of Europe to demand that we take stronger action to support Ukraine. What is that strong action? Look, I'm going to leave that to the experts. I'd like to see a humanitarian corridor set up toward Kyiv from the west. I'd like to see the United Nations condemn Russia, kick it off the Security Council, get a UN peacekeeping force in there, put the blue helmets on. Denmark did incredible work in the Balkans in the 1990s. I remember the Danish tank battalion that was there north of Sarajevo and what they did. Those Danish soldiers were incredibly well-trained and also courageous. And we need a UN force to stop this slaughter. What I learned from working with Richard Holbrooke is the most important thing is stop the killing. If you stop the killing, let the diplomats argue. That's what diplomats love to do. Obviously, this war is not going to stop, despite what you hear from diplomacy, until either Mr. Putin is defeated or President Zelensky gives up to save lives. And they all know in Ukraine, you can't give up to the Russians, because what you're seeing starting to happen in the south, in Melitopol and the other cities that they've taken, is first they arrest the mayor, he disappears. Then they clamp down on the demonstrations. Then they go through with the list of everybody who's could possibly be a Democratic activist, lawyers, educated people, and they arrest them and they disappear. And there's a list of probably tens of thousands of Ukrainians that someone wants to get rid of when they take over that country. So it's not like, oh, okay, well, we'll take a different governor who's just a little more pro-Russian and we'll agree not to be in NATO. It's a lot deeper than this. And these Ukrainians are fighting for their very civilization. That's what they're fighting for. They're fighting for that, that beautiful cathedral in Kyiv. They're fighting for the Ukrainian church that is going to be destroyed by the Russians if the Russians take over. So it's a very deep cultural, political, psychological fight. It's not just about who the next mayor is or the next president. And this motivates the resistance. So they can only do so much with courage and determination, but they have it. We need Denmark's help in this. Denmark has to speak up and encourage NATO leaders to, look, you can't hide behind the NATO red line, because they're coming, Putin's coming for NATO next. Everybody knows it. Putin has said it. Best defense for NATO is to help Ukraine stay in the fight.
And I agree with you that, you know, saving lives is the first priority. I think Denmark will be very hesitant to step up with supplying anything other than what is happening at the moment. And I think probably most of what our audience is also worried about is, of course, the risk of escalation. The risk of escalation and the risk of use of nuclear weapons. What is your view on that?
I think Putin is threatening a new use of nuclear weapons. I think it's dangerous to believe he's bluffing. However, I think it's equally dangerous to believe that we can't do anything because of his threat. Because Trine, there's no difference in the threat that Putin's making now than the threat he's going to make if he decides to seize Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. I was just this morning looking at a Russian TV broadcast where one of their top military experts on public television describes how they're going to take Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And of course, it will be accompanied by a nuclear threat. And when he comes into Poland, will Denmark say we can't do anything because there's a nuclear threat? But let's let him have Poland because we don't want to live under the threat. And, you know, this has to stop. The toughest fight that Putin will ever have in Europe is the fight he's having right now in Ukraine. I've known from the beginning that they would be his toughest adversary. They speak the language. They know exactly how the Russians think. They know their weapons. They know the tactics. They know the leaders. And you can be sure that there's a huge battle going on the radio nets as Ukrainians tell these Russian soldiers, you better surrender or else. You've come into my country. You're not welcome. Either go home or turn yourself in right now. And that's going on right now as they're talking to Russian lieutenants and captains and sergeants on these radio nets. And I think it's having an impact. But this is why it's important to understand it's not like you can say to Ukraine, well, gee, it's too bad, 40 million people, but we've got NATO and don't worry, there's no problem with NATO. There's always going to be a nuclear problem. We have to face up to that problem now. That's why I encourage Denmark to be one of the leaders in the thought of moving forward here.
What do you think? What you've been saying raises so many questions, and some of them are already in here. You mentioned this long list with people who will probably disappear if Russia were to win this war. One of the questions from the audience has been, what should Zelensky do? Should he risk staying, or should he go to Poland? He should stay. What will happen if he's caught? Will they kill him?
He's not going to get caught until really everything's over. And at that point, he will have appointed a successor who will develop a Ukrainian government in exile, perhaps. But I don't want to think about that. That's not an acceptable answer. And this idea that I hear some people saying is, well, if the Russians take it, they don't have enough forces to occupy it. And anyway, we could always start a guerrilla war and so forth. It's not Afghanistan. Now, nobody should understand better than Denmark that if the enemy occupies your country, it's really hard to have a resistance movement against him. I remember coming to Denmark to see some of my friends a few years ago, and we talked about this. Yes, the Danish fleet was scuttled. The Germans came in, and it was several years, and only after the Allied invasion, really, and that Denmark could muster a resistance movement, because the people who were in charge in Denmark, okay, they took the Germans. Yes, Jews were arrested. Yes, resistors were arrested and shot, but they basically had the same dilemma that every European country had that was occupied by Germany. It's there's a French TV series called A French Village. I don't know if you've seen it on Netflix. It's there. It goes through this dilemma very clearly. The Nazis come in. The mayor says, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? If I fight them, they'll just eliminate me. I have to do the best I can for my people. And, it just gets worse and worse, and he becomes more and more complicit. This is the way occupations work. So I want to make sure that those of us in the West don't believe that Ukraine can be converted into an Afghanistan where an occupying army can be resisted for 20 years. This will not happen. It will not happen. You'll lose all of the people in Ukraine who were Western oriented, democratic, but there'll still be people there who have to eat. They have to work. They have to survive, and they'll keep their heads down. And maybe they don't like the Russians, but you've got a family, you've got kids. What are you going to do? So this is what happens when European countries are occupied. It's not like a tribal society where where the tribal chief says, okay, you've got 6 kids. I want 2 of them to go out and work with the Taliban to fight. That won't happen. That won't happen here. So this is the time that the West has to really think about what's happening, understand it, and resolve to help Ukraine.
That's a very bleak picture. And I guess it's also what you're saying is also relevant for Russia, because Russia, I think we have to conclude now, it has become a totalitarian state. So presumably it will also be difficult to actually expect some sort of rebellion or resistance in Russia against what's happening now. What's your assessment of what's going on in Russia?
1995 at dinner at the Dayton peace talks. And it was the night that Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. Very shaken by this. It could have only happened from a member of security guards. Well, yes, that's the way dictators think. They know that ordinary people won't dare do anything, but they're most vulnerable to their own security detail. Sure enough, that's what happened to Israeli Prime Minister Rabin. You can be sure that Vladimir Putin has worked over his own security detail again and again and again. That's the way we're going to get rid of him if it ever happens.
That was a little bit choppy, I'm afraid.
Could you
I could get the gist.
I'm sorry.
I'm not sure what.
Could you hear that or?
Sorry. What did you say?
Should I say that over again?
No, I don't think so. I think the gist was there. So let's continue. So I wanted to, as I said, I am sitting in Sweden, and I also wanted to talk a little bit about enlargement, because one of the extraordinary things of having lived in Sweden for 12 years is that when I first came here, practically, well, most people either didn't know very much about NATO, and they certainly weren't very interested in NATO. This, of course, has changed very much over the last few weeks, where there is now a majority in Sweden, according to some polls, that there's a wish for joining NATO. What is your take on that? And particularly, what do you think would be Russia's response? And I'm thinking here of the NATO meeting in Bucharest in 2008, where NATO said that Georgia and Ukraine will join NATO. Was that perhaps a mistake to have said that and not to have acted on it, or should it just not have been said? Could a similar scenario play out with Russia in Sweden and Finland, if they are saying they would like to join NATO?
I think
just some speculation.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think, Trina, if you can hear me, I think this war will change everything about NATO. I think NATO will become much more vigorous in preparing its defense. I think Denmark will have to spend more money on its military. I think that depending on how it ends, Ukraine may become a part of NATO as well as Georgia, or maybe never. We just cannot foresee it. This is an inflection point. Vladimir Putin has gambled his whole future on the conquest of Ukraine. He knows if he conquers Ukraine, he believes that Europe will ultimately collapse, that the EU will be shattered, that NATO will fall apart, and that he will, by piece, prove that NATO cannot defend and will not defend its eastern members. He will reestablish the space of the Soviet Union including control of the Baltics and Poland. And Denmark will become a frontline state. So understand that we don't know what's going to happen. This is a watershed in world history. This is like 1938, 1939 in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think what we're witnessing is a transformation of the international order that has not happened since this happened in 1945, as you know, but this is a very rare thing to happen, and always something that is accompanied with violence and turmoil and upheaval and uncertainty. So I think you're right. We're heading towards such a period, and probably talking about what will happen in NATO may be a little bit futile, because it may be that NATO will have to not just write a strategic concept to be agreed in July, but actually to look more closely at at the treaty as well. I wanted to ask some questions about Article 5 and your experience as Sakya in how do you interpret what is an Article 5 situation? Because obviously, if Russia was to do as you're suggesting and make an attack on Poland or Baltic states, well, that's very clear cut, an Article 5 situation. But what about more ambiguous, either intended hybrid incursions into NATO territory, whether it is in cyber or in reality, as it were, or whether it is a mistake? For example, a missile that lands in Poland by mistake or in Romania by mistake. What would Sakya, that is there now, what would he have to think about in that situation?
Well, I think NATO is going to become increasingly brittle in this respect, so that anything that looks ambiguous will be determined to be an attack and a violation that would invoke Article 5. I think that's the way it has to be. NATO cannot allow its member states to be picked apart by hybrid warfare. But Trine, the most difficult circumstance is, let's say, in Latvia, there's a civil disobedience. Russian speakers are saying they're being abused and discriminated against. There are massive demonstrations. And suddenly, out of that, Russia says, these are our people, you can't do this to them. And the airborne division from Pskov shows up. And meanwhile, NATO members are calling for calm, and Latvia is saying, I've got the situation under control. And suddenly they're fighting Russian forces. And the Russian forces, within a day or two, overwhelm the Latvians. The Latvians are driven back into the forests. They're still resisting, but they don't hold Riga. A Russian ship arrives in Riga. It carries a Russian-speaking Latvian who says, we need friendship with Russia. We've always been part of Russia. This is, I'm declaring here a new government in Latvia. What does NATO do?
You tell me.
At this very moment, there's a Russian military analyst explaining on Russian TV how Russia will retake the Baltic states, including making a deal with Sweden to put the SA-400 air defense systems in Gotland, and then declare a no-fly zone over the Baltic. Mm-hmm. So there are many different scenarios that could be executed here. The point is that NATO's not safe hiding behind a red line.
And that red line being, just to make clear?
Yep. Now, Trine, your first questioner said, what if the war ends with a sudden Russian political and military collapse? Should we be prepared for something like the Marshall Plan? Yes, but The first thing, if there's such a collapse, is you have to go into Russia and you have to find the mafia that run the Russian state, the GRU FSB mafia, and they have to be arrested. And the files have to be opened. You'll find that most of the mischief in the last 100 years in the world has been created by Russia. In German Red Army faction, the Red Brigades, the Rossi in Italy, in the 1970s, the assassination of the Pope, all of that is could be laid at the feet of Russia. And the same people are running Russia today. The people around Putin, Patrushev and others, they're just old Russian intelligence people. They've never changed their views. So you can't go in and give those people money and expect a different outcome. You've got to take those people and arrest them. They are guilty of crimes against humanity.
I don't think I asked that question, but that's very, very interesting. And I think you are right about a lot of the things that we see happening in the United States, for example, meddling in the presidential election, etc., can be put down to Russia. I completely agree. So what I was going to ask you really is, how long has a mission like the one Putin has started now, how long has that been in the planning stages? Do we go back months, years? How long has this actually been something that has been on the drawing board?
Years.
And is that just for the military operation? I mean, it's
been in the planning. It's been planning. Yes. The military operation was planned before the Russian equipment. The military operation's been planned for, let's say, a decade or more.
So why have we had intelligence on this? And it's just been there's just been a change in this open intelligence practice to share intelligence in the last few months, or is this something that has been known within military circles for years, this planning?
You can't, Western publics have known, all of this material of this plan was available to the public. People didn't pay attention. Mm-hmm. In World War II, Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, was available to the public. People didn't believe it. As recently as December, most of my European friends would say, oh, Putin, he would never invade like that. I mean, he would, go into a country and invade it and kill people? Let me tell you, he did do this. He will use chemical weapons if necessary. He will try to use nuclear weapons if that's required. And it won't be any different with NATO. And so if you think you can hide behind the NATO line and say, well, I'm so sorry about the people in Ukraine, it's too bad, but at least we're safe with NATO. You're no safer with NATO. This is the time Putin has to be stopped.
And what do you think is the likelihood of the use of, I presume you are referring to tactical nuclear weapons and chemical weapons, which is a very distressing thing.
Well, I think the likelihood is on chemical weapons, it all depends on how the battle goes. The tougher the Ukrainians are, the more frustrated Putin's going to become, and the greater the likelihood he will use these weapons. And the more he uses, the greater that likelihood, the greater the condemnation from the world. So he's digging himself deeper into a hole, but he doesn't see that. People around him hopefully see that. This is why we have to move forward in the United Nations with war criminal indictments. We have to use international law This is what we're fighting for. This is not the 19th century where Prussian troopers could march across Europe and monarchs would say, okay, I'll sign away this province. This is the 21st century. We have to use international law. So please, Denmark, speak up.
I don't know if our Prime Minister is watching. I don't think so, but perhaps your plea will be heard amongst the policymakers in Denmark. You're presenting a very depressing outlook, which perhaps should prompt me to ask one of the questions from the audience, asked by Peter Jacobsen. He asked, how likely is Putin's actions to motivate a possible coup against him?
I think if he uses or tries to use a nuclear weapon, a significant nuclear weapon, I think there are people who will resist that. Reasonable Russians will resist that.
And can they do that? I mean, clearly it doesn't help to resist by standing in the Red Square with a note that just gets you.
You might never know. There might be a shooting incident. There might be a rebellion. It might succeed or it might fail. You might never know if it failed, but there will be those who resist by force.
I also have a question. This is from Søren Bæk Hansen, who wants you to tell us a bit about the strength and fighting habits of the pro-Russian Ukrainians within Ukraine, i.e. in the Donbass region, who were already fighting before Russia invaded Ukraine. And it's just an open-ended question whether you can tell us anything about them.
Well, these forces were mostly composed of Russian leadership at the officer level and either convicts or mercenaries. Very few local people joined those forces. They were poorly trained and harshly disciplined. They were to be used as cannon fodder, if you understand what I'm saying. They were to be the front line, to be pushed into the Ukrainians, to absorb the casualties and absorb the Ukrainians' efforts while the main battle went around them.
I suppose connected with the Donbass and the eastern part of Ukraine, is there a diplomatic solution here? Are we looking to the possibility of a negotiated end to this war with some concessions in terms of territory from Ukraine to Russia? Would that do it?
I think it is a knife edge. If it tilts in Putin's favor, he simply continues to grind away. If Putin starts to lose on the ground, I don't think you can tell Ukraine, okay, don't hurt the Russians too badly. Why don't you go ahead and let them have Crimea and Donbass and let's call it a day? Not after they've killed all these people, not after they've done $1 trillion worth of damage in Ukraine. So I think there is always this possibility of some diplomatic solution. And I'm not saying you shouldn't talk, but you have to recognize that the talking is a political gesture by Putin to reduce Western assistance to Ukraine. That's mostly the intent.
But I mean, you presented a very bleak picture, and I'm sure there's about 50 people sitting here being very depressed now, which of course we were already from all the pictures that are coming in on our TV screens and our social media, etc. But one wonders as well whether you could say that there has been the effect has certainly been to consolidate the Ukrainian nation. There's no doubt now that Ukraine has a sense of nationhood that it perhaps didn't have so much before, and unity, etc. With that in mind, is it possible for Putin to achieve his political goals with this war?
I think Putin's political goals have shifted. I think when he began, maybe based on his faulty intelligence, he believed that, at least in some parts of Ukraine, these Russian troops could be welcomed as liberators. Maybe he believed that the Ukrainians could be tricked into accepting a Russian surrogate as their president. He can't have that goal anymore. Now it's just a matter of subjugation. It's a matter of crushing Ukraine and its spirit until you have nothing left but individuals struggling for survival, willing to compromise whatever their previous beliefs were. Give me bread, give me shelter. That's Putin's goal right now. Now, you say this is a depressing comment, okay? But 6 weeks ago, my European friends, when we predicted an invasion, said, oh, that's too depressing. He wouldn't do that. So, look, Europe has been sheltered from war since 1945. Yes, I mean, we've sent peacekeepers everywhere. And as I said, the Danish army's been great. And I loved working with Denmark. And I visited there so many times. But you've been sheltered from this. You can't understand the temperament of a man like Putin. His whole life has been directed at destroying Western civilization. From the time he was in grade school or shortly thereafter and went to his first KGB academy. That's the way he sees the world. He sees us as threats. He wants to take away the rule of law, the respect for human rights, the voting, the parliaments, the democracies. Oh, he'll say democratic things. He'll say there's a Russian Duma, doesn't do anything. It's about him. He wants autocratic control, and he's willing to kill for it and kill a lot of people for it. Now it's time Europe woke up.
General Clark, this has been, I know you have to go to another engagement. This has been an absolute, I was going to say pleasure. It's been a pleasure talking to you, but it has been horrific listening to what you have to say and your assessment, which I think is certainly something that Europe has to think about and act on together with the United States. If there's one thing that has come out of this, I think NATO is a much more cohesive alliance, but I also hear what you're saying, that the old NATO perhaps is not going to do the job anymore. Perhaps we need something completely different in NATO. So I'm not sure you've given us the answers. I think there's so many more questions that we have to process and be thinking about amidst all this this misery. So thank you so much for your willingness to share your knowledge and your experience. I know you are incredibly busy. I also want to say thank you to Anders Bo Rasmussen, who is here with us from the Center for American Studies, and Professor Sten Winning, former head of the Center for War Studies, who have both been instrumental, I think, in setting up this this event. So thank you to them, and thank you to you. Also, thank you to our audience. You've been joining us with questions, and those who didn't make it because of the change in time of this event, you can link up with our website and see this conversation shortly. I'd also encourage you to have a look at our war studies dossier, where we have started a dossier on the war in Ukraine, and we upload articles and commentary on there continuously. So please have a look on that. So I don't know whether to just to say keep safe to all of us, keep thinking. I think we are at an inflection point. You are absolutely right. And perhaps keep positive within all this. So thanks very much. Thank you.
I'd like to see you demonstrate in the streets of Copenhagen and elsewhere in support of President Zelensky in Ukraine, and demand that European governments, I don't know if it's NATO or some other government, take action. Don't let this evil persist in our world. This is the time to stop it.
This is the time to wake up.
Absolutely.
We hear you.
And act.
Act. Yes, you're absolutely right. Thank you very much. Thanks. Bye-bye.